Are you having an existential crisis and looking to make a change? Have you started Googling the best cities to move to? Did your favorite influencer just move to Paris and you're wondering, can I do it too? Lucky for you, I have some experience in that department. So allow me to tell you how I moved to the City of Lights. Paris, baby! So first of all, why did I want to move to France? I have been studying French since high school. In college, I studied abroad for a couple months in Lyon with a host family. And since then, I always knew that I wanted to come back and live and work in France, but I thought maybe it was just something that I was dreaming about, that it wouldn't actually be a possibility. And so I started working in Dallas. When I was working in Dallas, I met Ben, who is lovingly filming this for me right now. He is French and he was living in Dallas at the time when I met him. He moved to Montreal. We were doing long distance for about a year, and he was planning on coming back in 2020 to Dallas. He was planning on moving back around May 2020. Obviously, March 2020 kind of fucked that up for us. He had to move back to France because his industry wasn't hiring anymore. And it was at that moment that I started thinking like, maybe I could actually move there. That's when I started doing research into how I could actually come here. So you might be asking like, okay, how can you come here? There are basically three main ways to move abroad to another country. You have the student visa, the marriage visa, or the working visa. Why didn't I choose student visa or marriage visa or au pair? I didn't choose those options because I have a very expensive student debt payment to pay every single month, and I basically just need to have enough money to pay that off and be able to live and survive. In addition, yeah, I just wasn't ready. I'm not ready financially to pay for a master's degree or a PhD. And the marriage thing, I mean, it's a huge life decision. Obviously, that's a two-people decision. Ben and I both didn't really want to do that one if we didn't have to. And it's also like a lot more restrictive in terms of working. If I wanted to get married to Ben to be able to move here, I have to not work for 6 months. And yeah, 6 months of expenses is a lot, and I just wasn't prepared. Ben and I both were not prepared to do that. So didn't choose that one. I didn't choose au pair because in general, you have to live with the family that you work for. And it also like just is a very young student type thing to do. And I was like 4 years into my career at the time, and I wanted to find something, if possible, that still was in line with my career. The student visa and the au pair visa and the marriage visa, you know, they weren't right for me, but that's not to say that those are not good options if you want to move here. I think the student visa is especially interesting if you have the ability to pay for a master's degree here. It's cheaper to do a master's here. And if long-term you want to be in France, they give you like a year after you graduate to find a job. And they really like want to incentivize you to stay here in France if you get your education here. So that's a great option if you can do it. It just wasn't the right one for me. Okay, so how did I find a job? I think the first thing you need to know is what my philosophy was when I was searching for a job. Essentially, I was ready to take almost any type of job. I was like, I will do anything to move to France. I knew that it needed to be able to cover my minimum student debt payment, which I talked about earlier, and it also needed to cover just my basic life expenses. I knew that I would be cutting a lot of my expenses because I wouldn't have a car, and I would be living in a smaller space, and I would be splitting a smaller space with another person. So all that to say, like, I was ready to take a pay cut coming into France. Okay, so I would recommend knowing what salary you want to have ahead of time. Just calculate your minimum expenses and keep that in mind when you're searching for a job. In addition, the salary that you're going to be offered is your salary brut, which just means that it doesn't have any of the taxes taken out of it yet. So you have to think about that. In France, there's a lot of taxes. They're known for having a lot of taxes. So you're probably going to be paid like around 70 to 75%, potentially even less than that of the brut salary. Next, I just wanted to talk briefly about my advantages and my disadvantages in this area because I think that it can be helpful for you. First advantage is that I speak French and I speak it at a pretty good level. It's not required for a lot of jobs in France, especially as an Anglophone. English is really like desired, but it is a huge plus, and it definitely is a reason why I think I was chosen for this job that I have now. My next advantage is that obviously I have a boyfriend who's French who can look over my resume, he can practice interviews with me, etc. But you can definitely ask strangers on the internet to do this for you, or ask your French professors. there's lots of different resources for that. My disadvantages mainly were that I don't have a master's degree. In France, it's quite normal that everybody has a bac plus 5, which basically means that they've done their bachelor's degree, the equivalent of a bachelor's degree, in 3 years, and then they do 2 more years and they get a master's degree. And that's like extremely common. Almost everybody in France goes to this level of education, or at least in the career field that I was looking in. So that's quite normal, and I didn't have that. I just had a bachelor's, so that was definitely a disadvantage for me. I think that having to compete against all the other Europeans, and they all have master's degrees, it definitely put me at a disadvantage. My other disadvantage is that I am not and was not a European citizen. If you are, you can like live and work in different countries quite easily. I'm American, and so I do not have that privilege. Okay, so what was my process to find a job? Essentially, I downloaded Notion. I use it to track all of my job applications. We also use this as a database for any resumes or cover letters that I wrote. I didn't really tailor any of my resumes to any of the jobs, but I did tailor cover letters, which I know is annoying, but I think it's essential to do. And in addition to that, I also wrote down any cold messages that I wrote to anybody or any email correspondence. I would keep track of those in Notion as well, just so that I would have templates to use if I needed to write someone again. I highly recommend cold messaging executives or hiring managers or whatever for any job that you apply to. I think that it definitely gets you noticed, and that's super important because you know that nobody's reading resumes. So once I started getting interviews, I would practice interview questions either alone or with Ben. I would practice in the mirror, or I'd practice on the phone with him, and I would write down any important questions that I think that they might ask me. Once I went through the interview, immediately afterwards, I would write down all the questions they asked me, how I responded, and how I felt about the interview. You have to remember that the interview process is a two-way street. If you are not getting good vibes from this company, or it just doesn't seem aligned with you, or it seems like maybe they're trying to lowball you or something, listen to that gut feeling. But also be aware of what you said in the interview and be aware of their question. They might be looking for someone who is very outgoing, and maybe you said like, oh, I like to stay in on Fridays and just read a book, whatever. So then you will know like, oh, am I going to be a good fit for this role, essentially. If you're looking to move to France specifically, I would highly recommend using Welcome to the Jungle. It's for startups, and in general, startups have an easier way to offer visas to foreigners. This is not legal advice. This is just my personal experience. I also use LinkedIn. Those are the main two websites that I used in order to find a job. I did pay for LinkedIn Premium, so I was able to see when people were looking at my profile and stuff like that. I'm not sure that really helped me, but it did give me some extra credits to cold message people, so that could be worth it. So how long did this take? So I seriously started looking for jobs at the end of December 2020 and the beginning of January 2021. That's when I was like super serious about it. And I applied to over 200 jobs. I think it was close to 220 jobs. I basically got rejected from all of them except for one. And I got accepted at the end of July 2021. So 7 months. It could take longer, it could take shorter, but that's just to tell you that you do have to spend a lot of time on this. You do have to invest a significant portion of time to be able to find a job. So I got the job at the end of July, and I was starting in the beginning of October, which meant that I had 2 months to get my shit together. That included applying to the visa, getting the visa, breaking my lease and moving out of my apartment, driving my car to San Diego, and getting a flight and moving to France. Let's throw it to Studio Gioya to give you a cost breakdown of this shit to do. Welcome to the studio. I'm your co-host Gioya, Studio Gioya, and I will be giving you a breakdown of all of the costs that were related to this move, starting with the visa application that cost $40, and in order to print my documents, I didn't have a printer, so I think it cost me around $10 to print all my documents, and then $15 to get passport photos. They did take my pictures at the visa appointment, but I didn't know if they were going to do that or not. The visa appointment cost $156.50, and I had to drive to Houston in order to go to this appointment. So I also needed to spend the night in Houston because I took a day off of work for this. So I spent one night in a hotel, which cost me $185. It's kind of expensive.
And I also had to pay for parking at this hotel, which I should have looked at that before, but that cost me $54. So maybe, look that up ahead of time. They printed out my documents for me, and they also did a picture for my visa. So technically I didn't need to print out my documents before, but it's better to be prepared in my opinion, because it just depends on the consulate, I think. The appointment took about 30 minutes, so it's not at all an all-day thing, but you do need to wait in line and you have to talk to the officers at the consulate, so you just need to have enough time to do that. I think that there's only a certain number of consulates in the United States, and they're in very specific places, so I was able to drive from Dallas by myself, but that might not be the case. You might have to pay for a flight, or you might need to find some other way to do an appointment. I think that you can also have an agent come to your city if you request it. So the biggest cost in this entire thing was definitely breaking my lease. We had just re-signed our lease in June, and like I said before, I got the job in July. So my lease agreement said that we had to pay 1.5 times rent, which in my case totaled out to $2,400. Yeah, it was really expensive, but I had that money saved up. I was prepared for that. So that's just something to keep in mind. If you're living at home, obviously this is a cost that you won't have, but if you are living not at home or living with roommates, something like that, you will have to think about these kinds of costs. This is specific to me, but I wanted to drive my car back home to San Diego. So my best friend Jenny offered to fly out to Dallas to road trip with me back home. And we decided to do it in 3 days. So we drove from Dallas to Odessa, then Odessa to Phoenix, and then Phoenix to San Diego. So we needed 2 nights in a hotel, one in Odessa and one in Phoenix. And this was about $180, and then plus gas, split between the two of us, it was about $80 a person. Next, I needed to get a flight to France, and I needed to decide how I was going to move my stuff there. Was I going to ship it over there, or was I going to just take suitcases with me? I ended up going the suitcase route, so I had to pay $555 for the flight and $175 in excess bags, which if I wanted to ship things over to France, we looked at it and it was just super expensive. I had this chair that I didn't want to bring to France. It was this beautiful pink chair. Anyways, I had to leave it and sell it because it would have cost like double the price of the chair to ship it over to France. And we would have had to pick it up at Le Havre, and that just would have been like extremely difficult. Finally, once I got to France, I had to pay for the carte de séjour, which is basically after my visa expired, they're supposed to give you like a residency card, and that costs $225. Now, the costs related to the visa application and the carte de séjour normally should be taken on by your company, but you usually just have to front it, and then your company will reimburse you afterwards. So in total, for the visa-specific costs, it cost me about $450. For the move-related costs, this cost about $730. And for the other costs, which were specific to me, so breaking my lease and doing the road trip, those cost about $2,800. And so in grand total, it cost me $4,039.10 to be able to move to France and to have a job. One other note I just want to make really quickly is that this is in 2021, so you have to keep that in mind. Costs for things could have changed, costs for rent, costs for flights, etc. I quit my job around mid-September and I started in the beginning of October, so that meant that I had 2 weeks of expenses to pay for where I wasn't making an income. And in addition, I moved out of the apartment, but Cora was still there for about a month or 2 until our lease was actually broken. So I still had to pay rent for the US while I was in France. So these are all of the expenses that I paid for when I was trying to move over to France. Everybody's situation is specific, but I just wanted to get you thinking about what you have to save if you want to move here. So throwing it back to Field Gioya.
Thanks, Studio Gioya. Back to our nightly news. So there's a couple things I haven't talked about yet. And one of those things is that when you are filling out paperwork in order to come to France, normally they ask you for a French address. And Ben was still searching for apartments at the time. And so I had a French address to use, and that was Ben's parents' address. This was huge because I could fill out all of my paperwork. They could see that I had an address in France that I was going to be able to go to, or they could send the paperwork to. And I had someone who was living there who could relay that information to me. And it also helped us in our apartment search because seeing that we already had an address in France just legitimizes kind of your dossier or your file that they use to, verify whether or not they want to give you an apartment. And that is the other thing that I also haven't talked about is finding an apartment. Um, while I was searching for jobs, that was my main focus. And Ben decided that he would take it on to look for apartments in France. And it just made a lot of sense because he has the ability to talk to the agencies, go to visits, see the apartments in person. And yeah, I think that that helps a lot. Obviously, I didn't do any of that process, so I'm going to let Ben explain to you really quickly some of the tips or things that he did when he was looking for an apartment.
Bonjour à tous. For apartments, you can always use Le Bon Coin, which is the Craigslist in France. But you might find pretty terrible things. You can use Sologer, or there is other website like this. And usually when there is no pictures, there's no point visiting because it's gonna be trash. So probably visit around five to 10 apartments, I don't remember. I was looking for something in a safe area because you would just arrive, so I wanted to find a place where you could go to work and come back late without any issues. And also something in like cute spot with light. So when you're looking for very cheap apartments, very small places, you might end up in somewhere without light, like not in a great spot, and that's not what I wanted. And also I wanted something furnished, so we could move in, and if we don't like it, we could go somewhere else without thinking about moving all the furniture. So the lease process is a bit different than in the US because you have to justify how much money you're making to have an apartment, and usually, especially if you go directly without agency, if you go directly to an owner, they will ask you for the last 3 salaries, what kind of contract you're having, is it a safe contract, CDI versus CDD. So you have to provide all that information so that your folder they're gonna look at it. But the good thing about that is like once you have an apartment, there is no lease to break in a way that you have to pay a lot of money in the US. You just say you're gonna leave, and in 2 to 3 months you can leave the apartments without paying anything.
That's great.
Woohoo!
The other thing I haven't talked about is that a lot of this is just luck. It's really lucky that I found a job that is in line with my career and that I vibe with the manager, that is a CDI, that gives me a visa for 4 years. Like all of that is lucky, you know? I could only control the things that were in my power, which were the number of jobs I applied to, the amount of time that I spent, and what that meant was that I needed to wake up really early to do interviews. Sometimes I had to do them on my lunch break at work. Don't tell them that. And sometimes, you know, I had to give up on going out for a night or something like that in order to be prepared for the interview in the morning. Yeah, those are just the little sacrifices that you have to make if you're willing to come here. In conclusion, people say that this is a pipe dream or that it's unrealistic or that it's something you shouldn't do. And I'm here to say that if there's a will, there's a way. I did not have a rich family to pay for me to do this. I did not have connections at a company to help me do this. All you need to do is dedicate some time to this and prioritize it. And if I can do it, then you can do it. So yeah, I hope that that gives you some inspiration. So let me know if I missed anything in the comments below. Feel free to leave me some questions. I will be doing a part 2, which will be a little bit more qualitative. It'll be more about like life in France versus life in the US, which I think is important if you're thinking about moving here. So yeah, leave those questions as well. And I will see you in the next one. I forgot what I was gonna say. Okay, hold on. What's my line? Stop. Have you started Googling the best cities to move to? And he was living in Dallas at the time. And after that, he moved to, it's really weird to talk about you like you're not here because you're like sitting right there.